Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As in real life, discussion on motor vehicles and motor vehicle technology has occupied more road space than looking at alternatives. So within the limited time I have, I'll try and summarize. The first point I want to make is that transport activity will grow and is necessary that it grows in developing countries in order to sustain economic development. And economic development in turn will generate transport activity. So our objective should be to see how that rate of growth in CO2 emissions can be reduced. But CO2 emissions, the total quantity cannot be reduced in developing countries. So the challenge is to see that the paths that growth takes is less carbon intensive, more environment friendly, and more energy efficient. Now the various challenges involved have been identified in the course of this day. The first is the growth in road transport of freight. There has been a remarkable growth in, as this graph will show you, if you took India as an example, there has been a consistent decline in the share of rail transport in favor of road transport and a growth in road transport. The use of inland waterways has not grown at all, notwithstanding the fact that we have a length of inland waterways about 14,000 kilometers. Our coastline is about 7,600 kilometers, yet coastal movement has not grown in any appreciable manner. We have not adopted a scheme like the Marco Polo scheme in Europe with a conscious attempt to shift cargo from the less energy efficient modes of transport like road to the more energy efficient modes of transport. As Vaidya pointed out, there is more CO2 emission in the movement of freight because the technology of the trucks used is still very substantially the rigid two-axle trucks and not the more environment-friendly multi-axle trucks. So there is a need to look at this whole area of transport of freight. The second issue that has been adequately addressed in the discussion is the rapid urbanization, the lack of adequate urban planning or integration of land use with transport planning that has led to more cities and sprawling cities and an increasing travel demand with reduced reliance on public transport. The third important development that is taking place in many developing countries, particularly in countries like India and China, is that rural transport is now being motorized with most villages and rural habitations being provided with all-weather roads. In India, out of about 500 and odd thousand rural habitations and villages, about 300,000 have been already provided with all-weather roads, and the target is to provide all-weather connectivity to all the rural habitations and villages by 2012. And this provision of all-weather roads is changing the pattern of transport, both of passengers and freight in rural India. Camel carts and bullock carts, which are substantially used to transport agricultural produce like sugarcane and cotton, are now being replaced by tractor trailers and tractors. Similarly, movement of passengers in rural areas is now being taken over by poorly designed, poorly maintained three-wheelers and kind of locally manufactured vehicles. I think it is important to look at this whole question of motorization of rural transport and how to make this motorization, both of freight and passengers, more energy efficient and environment friendly. The fact that public transport and NMT is declining has also been discussed this morning. While in Mexico City, on an average in India, the public transport accommodates about 60% of the traffic demand, that is steadily declining. And our projections show that by 2030, it would be around 45% unless that decline is arrested. Public policy, market distortions, external assistance, multilateral lending have all focused on creating more infrastructure. In fact, all the multilateral lending has been for more expressways, more flyovers, more parking places and the like, and not for the provision of public transport or for addressing ways of making public transport more, or to increase the share of public transport. The question of increasing emissions of criteria pollutants and greenhouse gases has been dealt with. Michael addressed it very effectively a little while ago. Although a number of steps have been taken in developing countries to clean fuels, to remove lead from gasoline, to reduce sulfur from diesel, the total stock of criteria pollutants has increased, albeit not to the same level as the increase in the number of vehicles. So this is again an area that requires attention. And then the question of energy security, the growing fuel consumption is a major concern. India, for example, is importing some 76% of about 170 million tons of oil this year. And our projections show that by 2030, we might be importing about 93% of 700 million tons of oil, which even given today's oil prices, hoping that oil prices do not reach a level of 230 or more by then, is a very daunting, is a very frightening prospect. And it is this question of energy security that has driven China to introducing fuel efficiency norms. But this is a chart to show you the kind of motorization that has occurred in India. And what is also interesting is that the Indian consumer preference is also changing. The purchase of the entry-level car, which was Maruti 800, is now falling, and the sale of SUVs, for instance, has doubled in the last 4 years. So the Indian consumer is also going much the same way as the Western consumer, expressing a strong desire for a larger car, for a more powerful car. Our projections show that if India grows at 8% in GDP, the number of vehicles could be as large as 640 million by 2030. Although the number of cars in that would not be more than around 110 million, the number of two-wheelers would be very substantially high. Whether it is 640 million or, as the ADB has projected, around 400 million, whichever number you take is a frightening number. And as the president of Renault Nissan has said somewhere recently, quoted in the Economist recently, there is nothing that can prevent the car from being the most coveted product that comes with development. So as per capita incomes increase, as aspirations rise, there would be a strong preference for purchase of cars. The question is, how do we reduce the usage of personal vehicles? Now, the mitigation options have all been discussed in the course of the day. There has been a fair amount of discussion of land use and transport planning. Ideally, they should be done at very early stages. But some countries, like Toronto notably, have established that even at a later stage, it is possible to build development around transit routes. And even retrofitting of developed cities to make them high density, provide for more transit, is something that needs to be attempted. There was earlier this morning a reference to the use of ICT to reduce travel. This is being attempted in some countries. For instance, in Bangalore, the local government has introduced a concept of Bangalore One, where you can pay all your municipal bills, address all your municipal contacts through the email. And there are kiosks in every center which facilitate this from happening. And this has considerably reduced or helped to reduce usage of vehicles. Increasingly, companies in Bangalore are allowing employees to work out of their homes using the information infrastructure, technology infrastructure that they have. These are all avenues that should be explored by the developing world. Now, there's been considerable discussion, especially in the last session, on setting fuel economy standards. I have some misgivings about Dilip's approach. I'm inclined to agree with Michael that saying that the Indian consumer has a strong preference for fuel efficiency is true, but nevertheless, what you're looking at is a static situation, and there is no reason why the Indian manufacturers should not be pushed to advance fuel efficiency in the vehicles over a period of time. Now again, looking at the technologies used in the developing world and their relevance to the developing world is perhaps not the best approach. There is no reason why, given the market in the developing world and the need to improve fuel efficiencies there, R&D should not focus on developing technology that will specifically address the issues and problems in the developing world. So there are, as was noted earlier, there are about 12 to 15 manufacturers who make 80 to 85% of the cars used in the world. There is no reason why they should not come around, sit together, and make a commitment on improving fuel efficiency and technologies in the world without waiting for countries to introduce standards. Similarly, the oil industry, there is no reason why the oil industry should not sit together and commit itself to cleaning fuels and without waiting for regulations. I think both the oil industry and the fuel industry have a large responsibility, which unfortunately one does not see them discharging. Setting fuel quality and emission standards is again very important. Establishing efficient inspection, certification, and maintenance regimes to improve the performance of existing in-use vehicles will go a long way to improve fuel efficiency and reduce consumption. Now, these are the various issues that are going to be on the top of the agenda of developing countries. And developing countries will accord priority to these issues. CO2 reduction, climate change would essentially be a co-benefit. I think what we need to do, a conference such as this should do, is to sensitize ministers in developing countries and improve their capacity to address climate change issues. But both together need to be addressed, issues of local air quality, of congestion, of energy security, of road safety, has to be addressed together with climate change issues. You can't have a Chinese wall between the two. This is again shifting freight from road to more energy efficient modes of transport has been addressed. Increasing share of public transport and increasing the share of NMT have been referred to this morning. But on this point, I'd like to refer to a very important distinction that the chair made. In the developing countries, public transport is provided largely to address the mobility needs of those who do not have an alternative mode of transport. What we've all been discussing the whole day is how do we provide public transport to wean away users of cars and two-wheelers from the usage of their personal vehicles to public transport. Now you're talking about two totally different categories of people. Public transport for somebody who is willing to take any form of public transport because there is no alternative. Public transport to a car user like you and me, who you are asking to abandon our vehicles and get into a bus or another form of public transport. And what we would demand is a category of public transport, a level of acceptability which is very different from the public transport that is being provided. So how do we reconcile these two totally different demands? How do we provide a public transport that would cater to all needs? What is the level of subsidy that this would involve? And what is the governance mechanism to make this possible are issues that need to be addressed. Now, restraining usage of personal vehicles is something that we discussed earlier. But what has to be noted, a point that was made earlier by Atanu Ganguly, is that you cannot restrain the usage of vehicles without providing an alternative means of travel. The two need to go hand in hand, something that Mayor Livingston has clearly demonstrated. The mayors that were pictured earlier of Curitiba and Bogota have clearly demonstrated. The two must go in tandem together. You can't have one without the other. There has been a fair amount of discussion on alternate fuels, but this is something that is some years away. What developing countries can do at best is to provide incentives, encourage the use of or introduction of hybrids, electrically operated vehicles, etc., in order to create a larger market for these vehicles. But I do not think that alternate fuels or hybrids are going to provide any short-term or even medium-term solution. Now, these various mitigation measures, each one of them can have significant impact, and clearly together all of them would have a very significant impact. I mean, TERI did some studies some 2 years ago looking at different scenarios and different policy options, and what the study indicated was that each one of them would have a significant impact on a reduction of fuel consumption and CO2 emissions. Taken together, they would have a large impact. The ADB did a similar study and came up with reasonably similar results. So did the IEA in 2007 in respect of China and India. Now, the way forward is reasonably clear. As Professor Gackenheimer said earlier this afternoon, each country must have an appropriate transport policy, and this appropriate transport policy should not stop at the national level. Each province and each city should have a transport policy that addresses its specific solutions and requirements. That policy must integrate energy security, air quality, and climate change considerations in the policy. And it must also spell out the mechanism of implementing that policy, because a policy is only as good as it is when it is delivered at the point of delivery. And that is what the focus should be on. All options should be adopted, and perhaps emphasis should be placed on the use of public transport and increasing the penetration of public transport and demand management, as this is something that is within the reach of most countries and most cities, and is something that one can start with. Now, international cooperation is again very essential to make this happen. There is a need to provide adequate financing and technical advice. A lot of discussion has gone on elsewhere in the world on just CDM funding, and that transport projects have not attracted adequate CDM funding. I don't think CDM funding is the main issue. The issue is an issue that Mr. Hook identified earlier this afternoon, that funding should be focused on what is relevant and what is necessary for a developing country, and not to back exports from the developed world. Funding should not be for large metro projects, which are high-cost projects and expressways, but should be to build capacity, to produce or provide technical assistance at the cutting edge, at the delivery point. There is considerable need for technical advice and capacity building, which are again areas that are not being adequately addressed, because bilateral funding and multilateral funding is not coming adequately for these areas. And this is again something which one hopes will change with the World Bank's new strategy on clean and affordable public transport. There is a need to provide transfer clean technologies at affordable prices. And as far as the role of the auto industry is concerned, I've already talked about the need for the auto industry to display a greater sense of responsibility. And it is here that organizations like the ITF can act as a change agent, take all these recommendations and considerations and place them before ministers of the member countries, so that they change their lending practices and transport policies to address issues of climate change. Thank you.